Hello and welcome to our special New York versus Donald Trump. I'm Ari Melber. We have breakdowns on this entire riveting week of testimony, including Friday's emotional moments for a longtime Trump aide, Hope Hicks, on the stand. This is one of those weeks that really showed how prosecutors are proving up this case, putting forward Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougall's lawyer, Keith Davidson, earlier in the week, all to confirm a very damning story that we've heard will come from Michael Cohen. But they've done it this way to confirm it for the jury before they ever hear from Cohen. And then corroborating all that with what we've told you about, the receipts, the checks, the contracts, and then ending this week with a rare view inside Donald Trump's uppermost senior aides and brain trust. Longtime Trump aide Hope Hicks taking the stand Friday and bringing jurors and the rest of us into these secret meetings and discussions as the Access Hollywood tape broke, as Trump and aides assessed its damage. Hope Hicks, you see there with Donald Trump, that is a coveted post in any campaign, and especially in his, someone who is up on the stage and in his ear and on the plane, and that is the role she had. So this was important testimony, including the deals to silence these women. It matters because this is reliable testimony from a longtime Trump loyalist. So that's hard for the jury to just ignore. It is also from a person, as a witness, who has clearly decided to cooperate with these kind of probes, to testify under oath, that that's the better course for Ms. Hicks. I want to mention that she did that today. We had some context leading up to Friday's testimony because she did that in testifying about January 6th. In that high-stakes probe, there she was, you may remember, she cooperated. She discussed what she knew under oath. She talked to investigators. She even discussed her own private text on that day, January 6th, where she told others she was so upset, quote, everything we worked for wiped away. What you see on the screen is the way we experience different probes. January 6th, they had the cameras on, and we saw her actually talking. Under New York law, it's transparent. We have the sketches, but we don't have video cameras in court. But both times, to be clear, Hicks was a key witness. She has cooperated. And that itself has led to this reported falling out with Trump, now the defendant. She said she was nervous today from the stand. She answered the questions, confirming she's under subpoena, she's paying for her own lawyer. And in a moment that does matter for a jury, this is still a human exercise, Hope Hicks broke down crying on the stand at one point. She was seen there crying. This was reported and discussed. It was apparently, best we can tell, and from the reporters in the room and the wider context we have, a genuine display of emotion for her as she felt the weight of this moment, the raw pressure of testifying about her longtime boss who stood, or I should say stood by, or physically, literally sat through her entire testimony watching her. And maybe the details were tough for her to share in this manner. Remember, Hicks went from a close aide in the Trump business to that position of campaign press secretary, a key post for a candidate obsessed with press. And while Trump has had his famous falling outs with many different aides, a lot of people didn't last through the first year of the administration, for example, she kept his trust. She eventually became White House communications director. She witnessed every Trump scandal, as the Washington Post put it, and her testimony here this week hurt Trump when she said that he had his hand in everything, that he was very involved. We were all just following his lead as she discussed the priorities of the campaign and communications. Now, why does that matter? The point isn't whether he's some apprentice-style boss or not. It's a much narrower point for the jury. It undercuts one of the Trump defenses that I've told you about. And he's entitled to his defenses. But one of them is, hey, I was out of the loop. I'm busy. I'm running for president. Other people are getting the stuff done. Well, this is Hope Hicks. This is not just nobody. And she's saying pretty much the opposite. He was hands-on. He set the lead. They followed. She also confirmed about what we heard from another witness this week. The Ronna Graff, the Trump assistant, was basically crucial. So that is corroboration. If the Trump attorneys get up and say, oh, who's this, who's that? Well, the jury's got Hope Hicks. They got the evidence. They see how senior a position she held, and she's the one corroborating these others. In another blow to Trump's efforts to find some sort of distance from the Inquirer, Hicks also confirmed with her own eyewitness account that she'd seen and heard Trump talking to the Inquirer chief, David Pecker, who was the witness earlier. Trump congratulating him on a phone call after the tabloid went after then Trump rival Ben Carson. Here's what's interesting about that. At the time in the room, she knows more than most people, but she might have still thought that Trump was just working the press like usual. You call the Inquirer one day, you call Fox the next. Now, however, the jury is hearing this wider testimony and understanding this as a potential confirmation of how the tabloid was carrying out Donald Trump's campaign edicts. This wasn't like calling someone and discussing them doing their independent reporting where you might share ideas and facts or a quote and then see what they report. This was, according to the DA, more like him calling someone who was operating publicly, commercially, sort of financially as an arm of the campaign, but doing it off the books. That's part of the crime the DA is trying to prove and why the Hicks testimony, combined with what we heard this week, was so significant. And I'll tell you, there's more. Hope Hicks also took the jury inside Trump world in a very unusual way. In the very private, panic moments when the campaign was rocked by the video you see on your screen, the bombshell Access Hollywood tape. Remember, nobody knew this thing existed at the upper echelon of the campaign, except for maybe Donald Trump might or might not remember what he said. And this isn't just any witness, as I emphasized. Prosecutors determined Hicks was actually the first person to bring the news of this impending video bombshell inside the campaign to the campaign manager to Trump. And again, you and I might remember Hope Hicks. Part of the jury might not. Not everyone memorizes every aide on every White House or campaign staff. But boy, are you going to think she's important if you determine that when the Washington Post had this bombshell, the person they went to, who they knew was a top aide, who would get right to Trump and the other leaders, wasn't the campaign manager, wasn't some other friend or family member. They went to Hope Hicks, the Washington Post reporter, contacting Hicks with this impending bombshell scoop and a deadline for any campaign response they wanted to give. She rushed it to the campaign leadership. There was a palpable panic. And she testifies how the initial response was, well, you need to hear the tape to be sure, but, quote, deny. And she recounted how candidate Trump privately knew this was going to be a massive story. She said this was a crisis. Now, take that in and say, okay, what are we talking about? We doing campaign memories? We doing one of these documentaries where you go back and look at an old campaign? No. The point is not that Hope Hicks has fascinating and sometimes never before heard details about that pivotal campaign moment, although she does have those. The point is that she was eyewitness to Donald Trump's apparent motivation, which the prosecutors say is now part of the criminal intent in what they have indicted as this cover-up and campaign felony. Hicks testifying that Trump saw all of this as chiefly a problem for the campaign. I'm going to read to you this key passage. Sometimes the key passages are just someone saying yes or no. The prosecutor says Trump was concerned these reports could hurt his standing with voters. Hope Hicks says, quote, yes. So that's some of the strong testimony the jury heard here to end this week. And a lot of folks probably remember where you were when you first heard about this tape. And its raw admission of grabbing women by the... And you might remember the fallout. Hicks recounting that very intense period, describing to the jury how it dominated coverage, leading up to the next big moment, which is the presidential debate. This was back with Clinton and Trump when a lot of people thought Trump was already down. This was a body blow like no other. This is legally relevant to whether Donald Trump was, as his lawyers have suggested, either not involved, didn't know what was going on, or to the extent he was involved, it was like a personal thing, or was it a campaign thing? And so we've put together, in the context of our reporting, beyond just what Ms. Hicks said today, some of that explosive period in the campaign homestretch.
Donald Trump's presidential campaign in turmoil tonight, facing withering political fallout.
House Speaker Paul Ryan released this statement canceling Trump's event. I am sickened by what I heard today.
Former Republican presidential nominee Senator John McCain pulled his endorsement.
When the tape comes out, he drops from 41 to 38. Then on the weekend, after everybody's seen the tape, he falls through the floor. That's why they are driving the Republican Party and Donald Trump off a cliff and into the political abyss.
Mitch McConnell called Trump's comments repugnant and unacceptable.
You do not recover from this. This election ended. All I can say is I am sorry.
Now, it didn't end, but that was the mood. Republicans did turn on Trump in that 2016 homestretch. That kind of reaction might be a little bit politically unrecognizable today. In the last few years, we've seen entire crimes and convicted sedition and insurrection dismissed by Republican Party leaders. Reminder of how much has changed once Trump did get out from under that October scandal to go on to win the Electoral College. This all matters in the trial because it speaks to the campaign motivations that I keep mentioning to you. And Hicks was damning on that point, telling the jury that Republicans who ran Congress or had the nomination in past cycles had particularly sharply worded statements against Trump over this issue, over what he said on the tape and whether that's how he dealt with women. She mentioned, for example, Romney, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell. Prosecutors view Hicks' accounting as key to what they're still trying to prove to the jury, why Donald Trump would, in October, take such extreme, they allege, criminal acts in the campaign's waning weeks. He was losing party leaders. His whole campaign was panicked. His own top loyal aides saw the problem. He was losing the narrative. He was losing the press, a lot of the mainstream press. And while Trump still thought, and by the way, let's be clear, politically, this was true. He thought at the time that he did have a narrow path left to the Electoral College and to winning. He also perceived that one more story or allegation that linked up with this tape scandal would certainly do him in. A guy who has all this bluster in public, a guy who never admits to losing in private, well, according to his own aides under oath, he's a bit of a different guy. Might be why he's effective. Got to remember when you're dealing with someone like this that they do play different roles. And in private, he thought, yeah, I'm losing for sure and I'm toast if one of these stories comes out. That, prosecutors say, is how he and his campaign leadership viewed the Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougall stories. Hicks confirming the DA's argument with evidence, with her eyewitness testimony, that Michael Cohen and the Inquirer had to bury both those stories and do it as a campaign plot for Trump to keep that narrow path even possibly open. Hicks asking Michael Cohen, for example, to get the tabloid publisher's number on November 5th. Remember I told you about the receipts? Doesn't matter what the jury thinks of either the two people in this communication or even what they're doing. What matters is whether they think people have told the truth and what they've said about what happened matches the other documentation. And this is bad news for Trump because these texts are in the evidence for the jury. And this is as good a confirmation as you can get in writing between key people who were both Trump loyalists at the time, going back to the tabloid chief, David Pecker. Hicks testifying, she asked because Trump wanted to speak with him, and so she connected the two of them. But she did more than that. She also connected the dots. If this sounds like it's bad and damning evidence against Donald Trump, it is. I would remind you that just because it sounds bad doesn't mean the story's over or he's guilty. He is legally presumed innocent, and they have to use the high bar of beyond a reasonable doubt for 12 people. So if they convince 10 or 11 people that everything you just heard really did happen and it amounts to this crime and it was this cover-up, that's not good enough. They need all 12. I say that to say that when we follow this case, as we do in our specials, we're not looking at it as a jump ball. We're not saying, is it more likely than not? We are really looking at whether the DA is carrying that burden and how this evidence may play with this jury. But they certainly seem to have moved the ball this week. We have Melissa Murray and Andrew Weissman as part of our special, leading us off, and we're back in 90 seconds.
I was becoming increasingly concerned that we were damaging his legacy.
What did the president say in response to what you just described?
He said something along the lines of, nobody will care about my legacy if I lose.
Trump aide Hope Hicks, that's what she looks like testifying under oath. That was in a different proceeding where we had cameras, the Jan 6 probe in Congress. We're now joined by our lawyers for this special, Melissa Murray and Andrew Weissman. Andrew, I know both of you watched this closely today. What did you think of Ms. Hicks' testimony?
I think your description of her testimony being a body blow is totally accurate. This, I think, took a sledgehammer to a major defense. Prior to her testimony, a big gap in the DA's arsenal was, did Donald Trump know about the payments to Stormy Daniels as hush money payments. The DA had conceded he did not sign the actual agreement between that Michael Cohen signed and that Stormy Daniels and her lawyer signed, but there was a blank with respect to this signature block for the president. Also, Michael Cohen had said, with respect to the payments, he had said to Mr. Davidson, maybe I'm just going to have to pay on my own. In other words, that Donald Trump was not going to pay in advance. So there was a lot of concern. Certainly, it's like, how are they going to link Donald Trump to the actual hush money payments with respect to Stormy Daniels? David Pecker had already given a link with respect to Karen McDougall, with respect to the doorman. But the case is really about the Stormy Daniels payments. And Hope Hicks, a reluctant witness who tearfully said, and this is from within the Trump campaign, said Donald Trump told her that he was aware that Michael Cohen had made these hush money payments. He tried to say, I only learned after the fact, which, by the way, doesn't matter. As long as he learned it and knew it before he was making all of these reimbursement payments, that's good enough. Right. But Hope Hicks not only said, did she say that he knew it?
If you reimburse someone for buying you crack, you're still on the hook.
Yeah. And so she gave that. She also suggested she didn't believe Donald Trump's story, that this was something that Michael Cohen did out of the goodness of his heart. She said, that's not who he is, and he likes to take credit for things. So she also said, I don't really believe that story in words or substance, but it doesn't matter. You're going to hear from the DA. It doesn't really matter whether she believes him or not, because as long as you actually now have Donald Trump knowing about the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, that's the predicate for the false business records. The major gap that the defense seemed to want to exploit has been completely closed by a witness who I think is going to be just impossible for the defense to say was lying and misremembered this, because it was so palpable in court that she did not want to be there and did not want to give this testimony.
Melissa, your view on the strongest testimony this past week?
Well, I think I'm a little less sanguine than Andrew is, and maybe a little more muted in my response to Hope Hicks. She did close that loop for the prosecution, but she did also close some loops for the defense as well. She emphasized that Donald Trump was very, very cognizant of his wife's own view of the things that had happened, certainly in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape, that he was very concerned about her, that he respected her a great deal, and had instructed Hope Hicks not to deliver certain newspapers that would cover the story to their residents so she wouldn't see them. And that's going to be a big part of the defense here. I mean, they only have to establish reasonable doubt for a single jury to hang this jury. And again, they can make the point that this was never about the election. This was always about his wife. To be fair, though, as Andrew says, she does link Donald Trump to all of this and his concern about the election. There's a lot of testimony there when the Stormy Daniels situation does come out in the press in 2018, where he muses that it's probably better for this to have come out now rather than before the election. I think that goes right to the prosecution's case. It's also the case that Hope Hicks herself may have opened the door for some probable impeachment of her character by the defense. She notes that she didn't even see the Access Hollywood tape, but her immediate response was to deny, deny, deny. It's sort of a classic thing that a PR flack would do, but it does suggest that she was already making the case for Donald Trump without actually knowing what had transpired on that tape.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're talking about alternative facts land, so that's sort of become, common. I guess the question is, which hat do they have on? And, I do think she has some potential standing with the jury there, and that she came through, unless she's the most incredible actor ever. Most people can't cry on command. Most people aren't able to just do that. And part of what juries do, as you both know so well, is use their eyes and ears to assess whether they think the current version of that they're hearing is basically true or not, or if somebody's actually lying on the stand. I wanted also, Melissa, to draw your attention to just how different a world it is. We all know what things have been like in the last few years, how cynical people feel about politics, particularly some of the Republican Party. I mentioned that in our reporting in the top of this program. To just go back and look briefly at how Donald Trump sounded in one of the only public statements he's ever made that could be called a partial apology, reminds you how much of a problem this was in October. Take a look.
I've never said I'm a perfect person, nor pretended to be someone that I'm not. I've said and done things I regret, and the words released today on this more than a decade-old video are one of them. Anyone who knows me knows these words don't reflect who I am. I said it, I was wrong, and I apologize.
I was wrong, and I apologize, quote unquote. Not a deep fake, Melissa, an actual statement under duress. How does that work in the story that the prosecutors are trying to tell through these witnesses?
So I think that goes to the point that the prosecutors have been trying to make, and indeed, I think Andrew is right. Hope Hicks helps to furnish that he was concerned about this election, that he was concerned about what it might mean with the electorate if news of Karen McDougall and Stormy Daniels came out, especially hot on the heels of the Access Hollywood tape. So again, though, it's a long time since this happened. I mean, we've had a pandemic, we've had a coup, we've had all kinds of things. Are the jurors going to remember that in October of 2016, this was all anyone could talk about, and it seemed like literally the worst thing that he could do? We've been somewhat inured to what he can and will do, and I think it's very likely that this might seem really quaint to the jurors, and sort of piecing all of this together as a campaign to get elected and to silence some of these facts that could come out and be really damaging to him. Like, that may be harder to piece together. But I think Andrew's right. She did a lot of good work for the prosecution today. I'm really interested to see how the defense uses her in their closing arguments. I think Emil Bove was very tentative with her today, likely because she immediately began crying. I think he would have bloodied her up a little bit more if she hadn't been so obviously in distress.
Yeah, and that's the human side of this, as mentioned. So I got about 30 seconds, Andrew. Any thoughts on that, on cross?
Well, I just want to take up something Melissa said, which is it's right to anticipate that the defense is going to be saying this is about Melania. It is important. I think there, obviously, as Melissa notes, there's contrary evidence in the record. But the jury, I think, is going to be instructed that you can have a dual motive. In other words, the state does not have to prove that the 100% intent in his head was the election. If there was a dual motive, that he was concerned about the election and his wife, he is still guilty. And so the state will be, certainly wrapping themselves around that jury instruction to say, the Hope Hicks testimony should be believed, including the part about the concern about, what Melania's reaction will be. But that doesn't mean he wasn't concerned first and foremost about, or even in part about, getting elected. So they can sort of embrace that part of the testimony and still win.
Right, and that speaks to, again, how people understand other people's motives. We talk about criminal intent and why jury instructions and other instructions can matter so much. It's like sometimes I might go running to get fresh air, but also hope to lose weight, right? And you can't just say, oh, I only went running for fresh air. That was the only reason, right? And so obviously the criminal motive has to be substantiated enough that it carries the day, even if there's other stuff in the mix. Andrew, Melissa, thanks to both of you. Appreciate it. Coming up, we have what the judge actually told Trump to his face about all this, a real rebuke. And we do more with these specials as we take it all in. I'm thrilled to tell you presidential historian Douglas Brinkley is here as we make sense of how all of this will live on for years and years, the first ever trial of a president. But first, the tapes. That's next. Our special continues as we track these star witnesses, damning evidence, and the judge letting Donald Trump, the defendant, know exactly what the rules are. This has been the third full week of a bruising period for defendant Trump.
The ex-president's election interference scheme was blown wide open.
Prosecutors called Daniels' former lawyer, Keith Davidson,
talking about how deal for Karen McDougall with AMI.
One of the most significant patches of testimony.
Trump's legal team tried to paint Davidson as an extortionist who made a career out of targeting celebrities.
Donald Trump has never been closer to spending a night in jail.
They are threatening to throw the Republican nominee for president in jail for talking, Harris.
City prosecutors have now called Hope Hicks
to the stand.
I think the jurors will not only be listening very carefully to everything that Hope Hicks is saying, they're going to be looking over at how Mr. Trump responds.
That is just some of what we lived through in 1 week. The judge also held Donald Trump in contempt for the first time. Everyone had been waiting on that. He was fined and warned he could go to jail if he doesn't shape up. Keith Davidson, the former lawyer for McDougall and Daniels, said Trump was worried all about the campaign, which, as mentioned, Hope Hicks has backed up. National Enquirer payments to McDougall were all about helping the candidacy. Prosecutors also played that audio of Cohen discussing Trump's feelings about, and therefore his knowledge of, his own reimbursed payments that went to Daniels.
I can't even tell you how many times he said to me, I hate the fact that we did it. And my comment to him was, but every person that you've spoken to told you it was the right move.
And our special continues with a special guest. Yogi Tuald is a former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney. Welcome back.
Thank you.
What stood out to you in this very dramatic week?
So, white-collar criminal cases are usually pretty boring, right? Testimony could be a drag, very document-heavy, very complex, but that is certainly not the case in this trial with Donald Trump. What stood out to me was Keith Davidson. This strategy that the defense has in really distancing Trump from Davidson, from these payments, in that they established that Davidson only communicated with Cohen, never Trump. And they brought out this fact that the only time that Davidson had ever been in the same room as Trump was in that Manhattan courtroom. He had never spoken to him about this. So that was, I think, a slam dunk for the defense. For the prosecution, he served one purpose, and that was to establish that there was a transaction, that Cohen did, in fact, pay Stormy Daniels, that he facilitated this whole thing, $130,000 in exchange for his silence. And so for me, I think that Keith Davidson did what he was supposed to do for the prosecution, but I certainly think that he helped the defense. And Hope Hicks's testimony today corroborated what he said, because what he did say after the payments were done, Cohen called Davidson and complained because he was expecting a job at the White House, right? I did so much for this guy and I have been left out. Then you have Hope Hicks saying, yeah, I don't know Cohen to do things out of the goodness of his own heart. He does things because he wants credit. He does things for self-interest. So what the defense is saying is Cohen made these payments on his own because he had other incentives to really bury the story.
Well, and let's dig in on the point you're raising, which is important. I think we talked a lot about how much ground was made by the prosecution. But again, I've reminded everyone, and you know this quite well, it's not like picking between two stories. It's not like, either Trump did it, does that sound likely, or did Cohen do it, does that sound likely? It's a much lower bar. It's only if the jury has reasonable doubt as to whether Cohen did it. And so I think that's important for us to emphasize, because if you're watching this as a viewer, you might say, well, I think this story is more likely. And I would say, based on the evidence, and the trial's not over, based on the current evidence, I do think that other story is more likely. But is there reasonable doubt as to whether Cohen went rogue? You're saying you think the defense is getting in points on that.
You just have to get one person to really think about this in the way that the defense is painting this out to be. And that is, Trump had other things in mind, that Cohen does go rogue, and Hope Hicks said this. He has self-interest. He wanted a job. He did this because he wanted to protect the big guy, right? His boss. And so the defense, I think, is scoring points enough to at least change one person's mind.
And then let me show you, because then you have, what earlier Andrew Weissman referred to, which is, but you still paid it back. Even if you say, maybe this popped up in a different way, take a look at Cohen describing Trump, then President Trump, paying him back.
I'm visiting President Trump in the Oval Office for the first time. He says to me something to the effect of, don't worry, Michael. Your January and February reimbursement checks are coming.
That's if the jury believes Cohen, because what the defense is doing is maligning and attacking Cohen's credibility before he even takes a stand.
And they're going to say you have the checks. I mean, that the checks exist.
Right. Well, so yes, Cohen is a convicted perjurer. Okay, so that clip isn't necessarily as convincing for me. Again, it's up to the jury and whether they find Cohen to be credible on the stand.
Are you surprised, or does it make sense to you that the DA sort of delayed Cohen? We heard about star witnesses, and he hasn't come up yet.
I'm not surprised. They have to tell a story, and they have to go in a particular order. And so they started, with the first witness, David Pecker, to really establish and lay the foundation on how all of this even came about, right? This catch and kill deal with Trump and Cohen. So the order that they're going in, I'm not surprised. They're telling a story, and they're building up to Cohen being, obviously their star witness. And maybe even he's got to be watching this. I mean, he's got to be hearing what's being said.
I mean, well, he's been doing live TikToks. I know he's watching.
I want to say that the prosecution is warning him against that, and he's just not taking heed. But that is something that he also can be cross-examined on.
Sure.
And he's just not being cautious. But I'm not surprised by the strategy of the prosecution in saving him towards the end.
Yeah. Really interesting point, especially to get some of your expertise on how these criminal defense lawyers work, because we're going to see both sides of it.
Yeah.
Yodit Twell, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Up next, as mentioned, the historian, Douglas Brinkley, as we live through history together. I'm excited about this one, and that's
how it works is you got a 98% offset, okay? These big gaps here is when you're selling a whole bunch of electricity back to the utility company.